What is up guys, Dzeeff here, and happy Halloween! I try to do a Halloween themed video on Halloween every single year, and this year is no exception. In today's video, we're talking about zombie type monsters, but we're not talking about the best zombie type monsters, we're talking about the worst ones in the entire game. And this is a bit tricky because pretty much every single zombie type monster is playable in some capacity. There is a ton of generic zombie support out there that works really great with pretty much any zombie monster, so all of these are at least a bit playable in some situations, but they are still pretty darn terrible. I do want to clarify here, I'm not going to go over any normal monsters in today's video. I think you guys all know that most level 4 or lower zombie normal monsters are not very good, so we're going to only focus on effect monsters for today's video. Admittedly, Sinister Serpent is probably better than a few of the cards in today's video though, which is pretty hilarious. By the way, if you guys are watching this on Halloween, tonight I am live streaming over at twitch.tv/Dzeeff. We're going to be playing some Halloween based decks, probably some Skull Servants, maybe some Pumpkin deck, who really knows, but it's going to be a lot of fun. That will be starting at 8 p.m. Eastern time, and I hope to see you guys there. Anyway, let's talk about some zombie monsters. First up, we have Zombie Mammoth, released in Crossroads of Chaos back in 2008. So while this card isn't exactly modern, I will say that it looks like a card from maybe 2003 or 2004. Zombie Mammoth is a level 4 Earth zombie effect monster with 1900 attack and 0 defense. It says destroy this card if you do not have a zombie type monster in your graveyard. When this face-up card is destroyed, inflict damage to its controller equal to its original attack. It's pretty hard convincing people to run a monster that only has negative effects. Yeah, these stats are all right, I guess, but by 2008 standards, Zombie Mammoth was absolutely outclassed by a ton of other great zombie monsters. Like I said, this feels like a card that would have been released back in 2003. I suppose you could play this card in a zombie deck which already played Creature Swap to give to your opponent so that it blows up and does 1900 damage, but even that isn't really that impressive, especially in 2008. Maybe this card was in Crossroads of Chaos because Konami expected you to combine it with Plague Spreader Zombie to make one of the Plague Spreader Zombie level 6 synchro monsters. I really have no idea. This card is absolutely terrible. Next up, we're taking a look at a card from Invasion of Chaos, one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most powerful sets of all time. Chopman the Desperate Outlaw is probably one of the worst cards in that set. It is a level 3 dark zombie effect monster with 1100 attack and 500 defense. It says when this card is flip summoned, you can equip one equip spell card in your graveyard to this card. Notably, I don't think this card is terrible only because it requires you to flip summon it to use its effect. In 2005, which would have been after Chopman was released, there was a competitive deck that had a number of cards that required you to flip summon them to activate their effects. You had cards like that Camel Zombie Monster, Swarm of Scarabs, Medusa Worm. These were all cards you could flip summon to do an effect, and then they could be flipped back face down to try and use those effects on future turns. So one of the big problems with Chopman is that it can't flip itself face down after you flip summon it. The other half of the problem though is that equipping one equip spell from your graveyard to Chopman isn't a very good effect, especially considering it requires a pretty specific setup. You have to set the Chopman, you have to flip summon it, but also you have to already have an equip spell in the graveyard. When you think of the Pac-Man deck, the card effects you were triggering were ones like draw one card, or pop a spell or trap, or pop a monster card. It also doesn't help that just a few short months later we got the Kickman, which is essentially a better version of Chopman. It has a much easier activation requirement. Instead of having to flip summon it, you only have to special summon it. So the Kickman is a much better Chopman, and honestly the Kickman wasn't even that good, but it's at least a lot better than Chopman. Next up we have Vampire Baby, formerly known as Red Moon Baby back in the day. Now I'm not going to be too hard on this card because it was released in 2002, but even back then the card was pretty much useless. Let's take a look at what it does. Vampire Baby is a level 3 dark zombie effect monster with 700 attack attack and 1000 defense. It says at the end of the battle phase, if this card destroyed a monster by battle and sent it to the graveyard this turn, you can special summon that monster to your side of the field. This was basically Goyo Guardian long before Goyo Guardian was released. The difference is that Goyo Guardian is a level 6 synchro monster with 2800 attack points, and Vampire Baby is a level 3 main deck monster with 700 attack points. Now theoretically you could power this card up with things like Acts of Despair or whatever, but even if you're doing that, I feel like you could have done something a bit better. Vampire Baby is so awkward to use if you don't have an equip spell in your hand, but even if you do have an equip spell, it's still not that good. Vampire Baby is just one of the earlier cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, so I'm not going to make fun of it too much, but compared to the other zombie monsters even back in the day, it's pretty darn bad. Next up we have Return Zombie, and I want to make a confession here. Up until I started researching for this video, I really thought Return Zombie was the worst zombie monster in the entire game. I really thought that for like the past 10 years, but while looking up every zombie monster, I found a few more that are actually worse than Return Zombie. But don't get me wrong, this card still really sucks. Return Zombie is a level 4 dark zombie effect monster with 1000 attack and 1600 defense. It says during your standby phase, you can pay 500 life points, add this card from your graveyard to your hand. You must have no cards in your hand to activate and to resolve this effect. Now I will mention here that Return Zombie released in 2007 in the TCG, but in the OCG it released back in 2004. Now still in 2004, Return Zombie is pretty bad compared to the other cards in the game, even the other zombie cards in the game, but obviously by 2007 the card looked even more dated than it already was. Return Zombie is terrible. There really aren't any zombie decks that want you to have no cards in your hand, and I think that the payoff here is simply not there. Return Zombie is very slow. It basically does nothing. I'm sure some people will argue that you can use it for discard cards and then you can add it back to your hand every single turn, but I think if you were looking for a card to help with your discard costs back in 2007, you'd be better off using a card like Volcanic Shell that was released that same year. So Return Zombie was pretty bad when it was released in the TCG. Presumably it was also bad in the OCG back in 2004. All around, Return Zombie is one of the worst zombie monsters in the entire game, but I think there are even more zombies that are worse than Return Zombie in my opinion. For example, in 2006 we got Malice Ascendant, a level 4 dark zombie effect monster with 700 attack and 1000 defense. Hey, that's the same stats as Vampire Baby. During your opponent's standby phase, send one card from the top of their deck to the graveyard for each Malice Ascendant in your graveyard. Now Shadow of Infinity had a bunch of cards like this that had bonus effects based on how many copies of a card you had in your graveyard, and I think Malice Ascendant was one of the worst ones in that pack. This card is painfully slow, and while you could eventually deck your opponent out with it, it's kind of a joke because in the zombie typing you already have Soul Absorbing Bone Tower, a card that is much better than Malice Ascendant. Soul Absorbing Bone Tower actually has been experimented with over the years in a variety of formats in a variety of zombie decks. So Malice Ascendant has a pretty tough card to go up against in terms of trying to build a zombie mill deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! But I do want to make myself very clear here, even if Soul Absorbing Bone Tower didn't exist at all, Malice Ascendant would still not see play. Finally, we have Humpty Grumpty, my least favorite zombie card in the entire game. This is a very strange card because it was released back in 2014. That was the very first time this card was introduced into Yu-Gi-Oh! It was part of the Korean version of Legacy of the Valiant, and then it was released in Japan later on in 2014 before we finally got it in the TCG in 2015. So this card, compared to some of the other cards in today's video, is actually worse despite being released many years later. Let's take a look at what it does. Humpty Grumpty is a level 3 dark zombie effect monster with 1400 attack and 0 defense. It says once per turn you can change this card to face down defense position. If this card is flip summoned, it gains 800 attack until the end of this turn. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually think Humpty Grumpty, a card released in 2014, is is worse than Chopman, which is pretty crazy. Yeah, it does at least have the ability to flip itself face down again, so you could reuse it, but holy crap is this card terrible. I think Humpty Grumpty really has no excuses because, like I said, unlike many of the other cards we've talked about in today's video, this is a modern card. It was released within the last 10 years. This card probably wouldn't have seen play even back in 2003 or 4, but it definitely was never going to see play in 2014. Humpty Grumpty is one of the weirdest cards I've ever seen. I have no idea why it was made, and I truly think it is the worst zombie card in the entire game. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I hope you are having a happy Halloween if you are watching this video on Halloween, and don't forget about my Twitch live stream tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope to see you guys there. I'll see you later though. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.